A poor single mother is kicked out with her elderly grandmother from her uncle's house. But what they find changes everything. If you want to discover the incredible turn of fate, subscribe now. Tell us which city you are listening from today. Now let's begin. The slam of the old oak door was a sound of finality. It was a crack of thunder that split Elena's life in two. The before, which was now a fading memory, and the after, a terrifying unknown void that stretched out before her on the cracked pavement of the driveway. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of a storm. A leaden gray sky pressed down on the world, mirroring the crushing weight in her chest. In her arms, her baby, Leo, stirred, his small body a fragile anchor in the hurricane of her reality. Beside her, her grandmother, Sophia, stood impossibly straight, her chin held high, a lone, defiant cypress tree in a barren landscape. "Get out!" her Uncle Luis had sneered, his voice a low growl. His eyes, small and dark like a boar's, held no warmth, no flicker of family connection. They were the eyes of a predator, cold and calculating. "This house is ours now. The paperwork is clear. Your mother left nothing for you but debts." He had waved a sheaf of papers in her face, the crisp rustle of the documents sounding like dry leaves skittering across a grave. Elena had stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. How could this be? This was the house her mother had raised her in, the house where Sophia had lived for 50 years. The scent of her mother's rose garden still hung in the air, a cruel, ghostly perfume. "You can't do this," she had whispered, her voice barely a breath. "This is our home." Luis's smile was a cruel gash in his fleshy face. It was a smile that held no humor, only a deep, chilling contempt. "Home? This is property, girl, and it belongs to me and your Uncle Jorge now." He gestured with a thumb toward his brother, who stood behind him, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Jorge's gaze was fixed on the floor, his face a mask of nervous complicity. He was the weaker of the two, a shadow that followed Luis's every move, too cowardly to act on the sliver of conscience that made his hands tremble. "Luis, Jorge, look at me." Sophia's voice cut through the tension. It was not loud, but it carried the weight of 80 years of life, of love, of sorrow. It was a voice that had sung them lullabies as children and scolded them for tracking mud across the kitchen floor. Now, it was laced with an icy contempt that made both men flinch. "Look your mother in the eye and tell me this is what your father would have wanted." Luis met her gaze, his own hardening into granite. "Father is dead, and he was a sentimental old fool who would have left us with nothing. We are just correcting his mistakes." He spat the words out, each one a stone thrown at the old woman's dignity. He took a step toward her, his large frame looming, and for a terrifying second, Elena thought he might strike his own mother. She instinctively tightened her grip on Leo, her body a shield. But it was Jorge who flinched back, muttering, "Luis, don't." Sophia did not move. She did not even blink. "You are a disgrace to his name," she said, her voice quiet but devastating. "Both of you. You are vultures picking at the bones of your own family. You have planted the seed of your own downfall today. Remember that." Elena watched them, the pleading in her heart turning to a hard, cold knot of righteous anger. She remembered her own mother, weak with sickness in her final days, whispering a warning. "Be careful of your uncles, Elena. Their hearts are full of envy." She hadn't understood then. She had thought it was just the fever talking. Now, the words echoed in her mind, a prophecy fulfilled. Begging them would be pointless. It would only feed their cruel satisfaction. With a deep breath that felt like inhaling shattered glass, Elena made a decision. She would not give them the pleasure of seeing her break. She adjusted Leo in her arms, his warmth a small comfort against the encroaching cold. She turned to her grandmother. "Come, abuela, we are leaving." Sophia nodded once, her eyes never leaving her sons' faces, her expression one of profound, bottomless disappointment. She turned and walked toward the small, worn cardboard suitcase that Luis had thrown onto the lawn. It contained everything they had been allowed to take: a few changes of clothes, Leo's baby formula, and a handful of old photographs. Elena followed her back straight. She did not look back at the house. To look back would be to surrender to the pain, and she could not afford that. Not now. As they reached the end of the driveway and stepped onto the empty road, a cold wind whipped around them, pulling at their clothes. Elena looked down at the tiny sleeping face of her son, wrapped in the only clean blanket she owned. She made a silent vow, a promise whispered to the memory of her mother and the vast, indifferent sky. She would survive. For Leo, for Sophia, she would find a way. The road stretched before them, a gray ribbon disappearing into an uncertain horizon. They started to walk. The road was a long, straight scar across the face of the desert. It shimmered in the fading light, an endless strip of asphalt that promised nothing but more of the same desolate emptiness. On either side, the landscape was a study in browns and grays, dotted with the skeletal arms of cacti and the low thorny scrub of mesquite. The sun was sinking, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. But its warmth had already fled, leaving a sharp, biting chill in the air. Hope was a word their hearts no longer seemed to remember. Elena's arms ached with a deep, burning pain from the weight of her son. Leo, who had been so quiet, began to fuss, his small whimpers escalating into a full-throated cry of hunger and discomfort. Each cry was a needle in Elena's already frayed nerves. She looked for a place to rest, a rock, a ditch, anything to get off her feet for just a moment. Her own body screamed in protest. Her feet were rubbed raw inside her thin shoes, and a gnawing emptiness clawed at her stomach. They found a large, flat rock a few yards from the road, partially shielded by a cluster of dry, brittle bushes. Sophia sank down with a weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. Her face, usually so full of strength, looked pale and fragile in the twilight. Elena sat beside her, carefully unwrapping Leo to prepare a bottle. The baby's cries echoed in the vast silence of the desert, a sound of pure, helpless misery. The sound, the desperation. It unlocked a memory Elena had tried so hard to bury. It came rushing back with the force of a flash flood. She was in a brightly lit cafe, the smell of coffee and sugar in the air. Across the table, Marco, Leo's father, had stared at her, his handsome face a mask of disbelief, and then cold, hard rejection. She had just told him she was pregnant. His words, when they came, were quiet, but more brutal than any shout. "That's your problem, Elena," he had said, not meeting her eyes. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the tile floor. "It was a mistake. We were just having fun. I have plans, a career. I can't be tied down." He had stood up, tossed a few bills on the table for his coffee, and walked out of her life without a backward glance. He had abandoned her, abandoned his own child, as easily as shrugging off a coat. That betrayal had been the first crack in her world. Her uncle's cruelty today had simply shattered it completely. A tear escaped and traced a cold path through the dust on her cheek. She angrily wiped it away. She could not afford to cry. Crying wouldn't feed her son or warm her grandmother. She finished mixing the formula with the last of the bottled water they had and gave it to Leo, who latched on with a desperate hunger. The crying subsided, replaced by the soft sounds of his suckling. Sophia placed a wrinkled, cool hand over Elena's. Her touch was surprisingly firm. "Do not let them poison you, my child," she said, her voice soft but clear. Elena looked at her, confused. "Your uncles, the boy, Marco. Do not let the hate you feel for them take root in your heart." "But how can I not hate them?" Elena whispered, the words raw with pain. "Look what they've done to us. They've left us here to die." Sophia's eyes were deep and sad, but held a profound wisdom. "Hate is a poison that you drink, expecting the other person to die," she said, her fingers gently stroking the back of Elena's hand. "It will eat you from the inside until there is nothing left. We must survive, yes. We must be strong, but we must do it with clean hearts. That is the only victory that matters." Elena looked from her grandmother's tired but resolute face to the small innocent child in her arms. Sophia was right. Hate was a luxury they could not afford. All their energy had to be focused on one thing: survival. She nodded, a fresh wave of determination washing over her. They would not be victims. They would be survivors. As Leo finished his bottle, a new sound intruded on the silence. The low rumble of an engine growing steadily louder. Headlights appeared in the distance, two bright eyes cutting through the deepening gloom. A flicker of hope ignited in Elena's chest. Someone was coming. Someone could help them. She stood up, waving her arms, her heart pounding. The vehicle, a large pickup truck, sped toward them. It did not slow down. For a moment the driver was silhouetted in the glare of his own headlights, a faceless shape. Then with a roar, the truck blasted past them, its tires kicking up a thick cloud of dust and grit that washed over them, choking them, blinding them. Elena coughed, shielding Leo's face with her body. The red taillights dwindled and disappeared into the darkness. The hope that had flared so brightly was extinguished, leaving behind only the bitter taste of dust and despair. It was as if the world itself was mocking them. They sat in silence for a long time, the dust settling around them. The cold was beginning to seep into their bones. Night was falling fast, and with it came the primeval fear of the dark, of the unknown things that moved in the desert. Just as true despair began to set in, Elena's eyes, scanning the horizon one last time, caught something, a shape, a silhouette against the last vestiges of twilight. It was low and square, almost lost against the dark line of the distant hills. It looked like a roof. She stood up, her heart giving a tentative flutter. "Abuela, look." She pointed. Sophia squinted, following her gaze. "What is it?" "I don't know," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. "It looks like a house." It was far off the road, semi-hidden by a thicket of dry bushes and stunted trees. There was no light, no sign of life. But it was shelter. It was a roof. Despite the fear of what they might find, the alternative, spending the night in the open, exposed to the elements and whatever else lurked in the darkness, was far more terrifying. She made the choice. We have to try. With Sophia leaning on her for support, and Leo held tight against her chest, Elena started walking again, leaving the cruel, empty road behind and heading into the scrubland, toward the dark, silent shape that was their only hope. The walk across the uneven, thorny ground was treacherous. Every step was a struggle against sharp rocks and grasping branches that tore at their clothes. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the crunch of their own footsteps and the whisper of the wind. As they drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a small, single-story adobe house. It looked ancient, its mud brick walls weathered and cracked by decades of sun and wind. It was huddled low to the ground, as if trying to hide from the vast, empty sky. There were no lights, no sounds of life. It was a ghost of a home. The front door hung slightly ajar, a dark, gaping mouth. Hesitantly, Elena pushed it open. It swung inward with a long, mournful creak that sounded like a suffering soul groaning in its sleep. A wave of cool, musty air washed over them, the smell of decades of dust, dry rot, and the faint, scuttling presence of mice. It wasn't a welcoming smell, but it was the smell of shelter. Inside, it was pitch black. Elena fumbled in the suitcase for the small box of matches she had packed. Her hands trembled as she struck one. The tiny flame flared to life, casting flickering, dancing shadows across the room. It was a simple, single space. In the center stood a rough wooden table and 2 chairs, all shrouded in a thick coat of gray dust. Against one wall was a stone fireplace, its hearth filled with cobwebs and soot. In a corner, a small kitchenette area held a rusty sink and a wood-burning stove. Everything was covered in the fine, soft dust of abandonment. It was clear no one had lived here for a very, very long time. "It's empty," Elena breathed, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. It wasn't a den of criminals or a squatter's hovel. It was just an empty, forgotten house. It was safe. Sophia leaned against the doorframe, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Elena helped her to one of the dusty chairs. In a small adjoining room, they found a simple metal bed frame with a thin, stained mattress, and tucked in a corner, a small wooden crib. The sight of the crib sent a strange shiver down Elena's spine. Who had lived here? Who had rocked a baby to sleep in this desolate place? They were too exhausted to question it further. Elena found a few old threadbare blankets in a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. They were dusty and smelled of mothballs, but they were thick. She shook them out as best she could and laid them on the mattress. For the first time since that morning, a feeling that was not fear or despair or anger flickered within her. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. They had a roof over their heads. They were out of the wind. Tonight, they would be safe. The first light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, painting stripes of gray across the dusty floor. Elena had barely slept, her senses on high alert, but the deep exhausted sleep of her grandmother and the peaceful slumber of her son had been a comfort. She rose quietly, her body stiff and sore. Her first priority was water. She took an old bucket from the kitchenette and went outside. To her immense relief, she found a stone-lined well a short distance from the house. It was covered with a heavy wooden lid. With a grunt of effort, she heaved it aside and peered down. The water below was dark but clear. She lowered the bucket, the rope creaking in protest, and pulled it up, hand over hand. It was heavy, full of cold, clean water. She tasted it cautiously. It was fresh. It was life. Back inside, she set about exploring their meager fortress. In the kitchen cupboards tucked away at the back, she found a small treasure trove. Sealed tins of lard, several cloth sacks containing rice and dried beans, and a canister of salt. The food was ancient, but it had been stored properly. It was edible. It was a miracle. While Sophia watched Leo, Elena started the long, arduous process of making the space livable. She swept years of dust and mouse droppings out the door. She scrubbed the table and chairs. She filled the kettle and set it on the old wood stove, coaxing a small fire to life with dry twigs she gathered from outside. As the water heated, a sense of purpose filled her. This was not just survival anymore. It was an act of defiance. Her uncles had thrown them out, expecting them to perish. But they wouldn't. They would build a life, even in this forgotten ruin. As she worked, Sophia watched her, a strange, thoughtful expression on her face. "This place," the old woman said softly, her gaze drifting around the room. "It feels familiar. I cannot explain it." Elena dismissed it as the rambling of a tired mind, but the comment lingered. Later that day, while cleaning the great stone fireplace, Elena's fingers brushed against a brick that felt different from the others. It was slightly loose in its mortar. Curiosity piqued. She wiggled it. It shifted. With a bit more effort, using the handle of a rusty spoon as a lever, she pried it free. Behind it was not more stone, but a dark, hollow space. Her heart began to pound. Reaching inside, her fingers closed around the cool, smooth surface of a wooden box. It was small and heavy. With trembling hands, she pulled it out. It was a simple, dark wood box, bound with rusted iron straps. The latch was stiff, but she managed to force it open. For a moment, she imagined it was filled with gold or money, a hidden treasure that would solve all their problems. But what she saw inside was, at first, a disappointment. There was no treasure, only a bundle of old letters tied with a faded blue ribbon and a small, leather-bound diary. Sophia came over, her curiosity overcoming her fatigue. "What is it?" she asked. Elena carefully untied the ribbon, the silk almost disintegrating in her fingers. She unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The ink faded to a pale brown. It was dated over 50 years ago. It began, "My dearest Arturo." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Arturo, that was her grandfather's name. Sophia leaned closer, her eyes wide. Together in the dim light of the dusty room, they began to read. The letters were from a woman named Isabella. She wrote of a secret love, of stolen moments and whispered promises. She had been a migrant worker, hired to help on the ranch when Arturo's father was alive. Arturo had fallen ill with a fever, and Isabella had nursed him back to health. In those long, quiet weeks, they had fallen deeply in love. The letters spoke of a passion and a connection that transcended their different worlds. Then came the letter that changed everything. Isabella was pregnant. She wrote of her joy and her fear. She knew Arturo's family would never accept her or their child. Sophia listened, her face a storm of conflicting emotions, shock, sadness, but strangely, not anger. "My Arturo," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "A whole life together, and I knew nothing of this. The poor woman." Elena picked up the small leather diary. It was also in Isabella's hand. The first entries detailed the secret joy of her pregnancy. Then came an entry that made Elena gasp. "Arturo has finished it," she read aloud. "He built it with his own hands, for me and for our child. A small, strong house of adobe, far from prying eyes, our secret sanctuary, our home." Elena looked around the dusty room, a dizzying sense of understanding dawning on her. This was the house. Arturo had built this house for his secret love. They read on, their hands shaking. The diary chronicled the birth of a son, a boy named Miguel, but their happiness was short-lived. Arturo's father discovered the affair. He was a cruel, unforgiving man. The final entries were frantic, filled with terror. Arturo's father had threatened her, threatened to take the child. Isabella had been forced to flee in the middle of the night with her sick baby, disappearing into the darkness, leaving her home and the love of her life behind forever. Elena's fingers felt something under the lining at the bottom of the box, a false bottom. She pried it up with a fingernail. Beneath it lay one more folded document. It was a property deed, a legal title to this very plot of land, and the house upon it. And the name on the deed was not Arturo. It was Miguel, Arturo's secret, lost son. The implications were staggering. This house, their accidental refuge, was not just some abandoned ruin. It was a part of their family's hidden history. It was a legacy. And legally, it belonged to Miguel, which meant her uncles, Luis and Jorge, had absolutely no claim to it. The realization was a bolt of lightning, a sudden, brilliant flash of hope and power in the darkness of their despair. But their moment of revelation was shattered by a sudden jarring sound from outside. The unmistakable rumble of an engine growing closer, headlights sliced through the twilight, sweeping across the front of the house and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Elena's blood ran cold. They had seen the smoke from her cooking fire. They had found them. "Get down," she hissed, blowing out the candle and plunging the room into darkness. She grabbed Leo, who had started to whimper, and pulled Sophia into the small bedroom, closing the door as quietly as she could. They huddled together in the blackness, listening to the sound of the truck door slamming shut and the crunch of heavy footsteps approaching the house. The vultures had come to find them. The front door burst open with a splintering crash. Light from a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam sweeping across the main room like a prison searchlight. "I know you're in here, you little brat." Luia's voice boomed, echoing in the small house. It was a voice thick with rage and entitlement. "You think you can hide from me? There's nowhere for you to go." Elena held her breath, pressing Leo's face into her shoulder to muffle his frightened whimpers. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Beside her, she could feel Sophia trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, contained fury. They heard the sound of things being overturned, the table scraping against the floor, a chair crashing against the wall. "What are we even doing here, Luis?" Jorge's nervous voice whined. "This place is a ruin. Let's just go." "Shut up, you coward," Luis snarled. She must have the old man's emergency money. Mother said he always kept cash hidden. She's probably got it with her. I want it. He was ransacking the small kitchen area now, the clatter of old tin cans echoing through the house. He found nothing. His frustration mounted, his breathing growing heavier. "Where is the old woman?" he growled. "She'll talk. She always was a soft touch." He started moving toward the bedroom door. Elena knew they were out of time. She could not let him lay a hand on her grandmother. The fear that had paralyzed her moments before suddenly transformed, crystallizing into a hard, sharp diamond of protective rage. She gently pushed Sophia and the baby back into the corner of the room and stood up. As Luis shoved the bedroom door open, she stepped out of the shadows to face him. "Leave her alone," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was low and steady, filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Luis stopped, momentarily surprised. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look what we have here. The little mother hen protecting her flock." He advanced on her, his bulk filling the small doorway. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. The pain was sharp and immediate, but she refused to cry out. She met his cruel gaze without flinching. "Where is the money, Elena? Give it to me, and maybe I'll let you and the old creature stay in this dump." "There is no money," she spat, trying to wrench her arm free. "Liar!" he roared, his face contorting with fury. He raised his other hand as if to strike her. "Don't you dare touch her." The voice came from behind them, from the main room. It was Sophia, standing in the doorway, her frail body shaking but her eyes blazing with righteous fire. Luis laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Or what, old woman? What will you do?" He turned his sneer on his mother, tightening his grip on Elena's arm. It was in that precise moment that everything changed. A blindingly bright light suddenly flooded the main room, pouring in through the open front door. All three of them froze, momentarily blinded. Silhouetted in the doorway was the figure of a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, holding a large, powerful flashlight that pinned them in its beam. "What is going on here?" a deep, calm voice asked. The voice held an unmistakable note of authority. It was not the voice of a police officer, but it was steady, firm, and completely in control. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" he asked, directing the question to Sophia. Luis instantly released Elena's arm, stepping back as if he'd been burned. His aggression evaporated, replaced by a defensive posture. "Who the hell are you?" he blustered. "This is a private matter." The stranger took a step into the room. He wore simple work clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, and sturdy boots. His face was weathered by the sun, with kind, steady eyes that took in the scene at a glance. The overturned furniture, Elena rubbing her bruised arm, Sophia's defiant stance, and the two brothers, one aggressive and one terrified. "I live a little ways down the road," the man said calmly, his gaze settling on Luis. "I saw your truck tear past my turnoff, then I saw the light and heard shouting. Figured I'd check to make sure everything was all right." He let his gaze linger on Luis and Jorge. "I know who you two are, the Vargas brothers. You have a certain reputation in town." The implied threat hung in the air. Luis and Jorge exchanged a nervous glance. They were bullies, not fighters, especially not against a man who looked like he could handle himself and was clearly not intimidated. Luis's bluster deflated completely. He was a coward at heart, only brave when his victims were weaker than him. "We were just leaving," Luis muttered, grabbing Jorge by the arm. He shot Elena a look filled with venom. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath, a promise and a threat. "You will pay for this." With that, he and Jorge scrambled out of the house, jumped into their truck, and sped off into the night, their tires spinning in the dirt. Silence descended on the small house, broken only by Leo's soft crying. The stranger lowered his flashlight, the beam now pointing at the floor, and the room was plunged back into a softer gloom. "Are you all right?" he asked Elena, his voice now gentle with concern. Elena nodded, still shaken. "Yes, thank you. You came just in time." "My name is David," he said, extending a hand. His handshake was firm and warm. "I saw the smoke from your chimney yesterday. I was worried. This place has been empty for as long as I can remember." Sophia stepped forward, studying him intently. "You live near here?" "About 2 miles east. I have a small ranch," David explained. "My mother and I moved to the area about 20 years ago. She passed on a few years back." He looked around the room, a nostalgic, sad look in his eyes. She used to talk about this house sometimes. She said it was a place from another life. Elena's heart skipped a beat. A cold, electric feeling prickled down her spine. "Your mother?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "What was her name?" "Isabella," David replied. The world seemed to stop spinning. Elena and Sophia stared at him, speechless. Elena slowly walked to the fireplace and retrieved the wooden box. With trembling hands, she opened it and held out the bundle of letters. "Did your mother write these?" David took the letters, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked at the faded handwriting and his face went pale. He sank into one of the dusty chairs, his strong frame suddenly looking vulnerable. "Yes," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. This is her handwriting. Where did you get these?" "They were hidden in the fireplace," Elena explained, her own voice shaking. "Along with this." She handed him the leather diary. He opened it, reading the first few pages, his eyes widening in disbelief. He read about Arturo, about the secret love, about the building of this very house. He read about the birth of a son named Miguel. He looked up, his eyes filled with a storm of questions and a lifetime of pain. My name was Miguel," he said, his voice cracking. "She changed it to David when we moved here. She said she wanted to leave the past behind, to protect me from it." He looked from the diary to Sophia, a dawning, impossible understanding on his face. "Arturo Vargas, he was my father." Tears streamed down Sophia's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. She walked to him and placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Then you are my husband's son," she said, her voice filled with a profound, quiet acceptance. "You are the brother of the woman who raised this girl. You are blood of my blood. You have your father's eyes." David looked at Elena, then at the baby in her arms. The pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed were clicking into place. He was not just a stranger who had stumbled upon a family dispute. He was family. These cruel men who had just threatened them were his own half-brothers. This house was his birthright. And these women, this young mother and this old, dignified matriarch, they were his kin. He stood up, his face set with a new fierce determination. He took the old property deed from Elena's hand and looked at the name written there. Miguel. His name. A righteous anger burned in his eyes, but it was tempered by a deep sense of purpose. He looked at Elena and Sophia, who had been so alone just moments before. "You are not alone," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "Not anymore. This is my house, and my house is your house. They will never touch you again, I swear it." In the dusty, forgotten adobe house, under the silent desert stars, an alliance was formed, and a broken family began to heal. The next morning, David arrived not in his truck, but in a larger flatbed vehicle loaded with supplies. It was like watching hope itself roll up the dirt track. He brought a small generator, and with a roar, it sputtered to life, bringing electricity and bright and naked light bulbs to the dark corners of the house. He brought bags of groceries, cans of soup, fresh bread, milk, and most importantly, a large box of baby formula and diapers for Leo. He brought tools and lumber, plywood to board up the broken front door, and new glass to replace the grimy, cracked window panes. The transformation began immediately. The house, which had been a desperate refuge, started to feel like a fortress, and then, slowly, like a home. David was a man of quiet competence. He worked with a steady, practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He showed Elena how to secure the windows, how to mix new mortar to patch the cracks in the adobe walls. Working alongside him, Elena felt a sense of empowerment she had never known. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and capable. The physical labor was healing, a way to channel her anger and fear into something constructive. Sophia, too, found her role. She sat in a chair in the corner, watching over Leo, her hands busy mending their torn clothes with a needle and thread David had brought. She would tell stories of Arturo, painting a picture for David of the father he had never known. She spoke of his kindness, his quiet strength, his love for the land. She did not shy away from the pain of the past, but she wove it into a larger tapestry of family and forgiveness. In the evenings, they would sit around the crackling fire in the newly cleaned fireplace, the generator switched off to conserve fuel. The small room was filled with warmth and the smell of wood smoke. They were a strange, patched-together family. The grieving widow, the abandoned daughter, the lost son, and the innocent baby. Bound by a shared history they were only just beginning to understand. In these quiet moments, sharing stories, a deep bond began to form, stronger than the walls of the house they were rebuilding. 2 days later, David announced it was time to make their position official. "The deed is old, but it's legal," he explained, laying the precious document on the table. "But we need to get it registered in my current name at the county records office. We also need your testimony, Sophia." He turned to the old woman, "A sworn statement from you, as Arturo's wife, confirming the story in the diary, will make our case undeniable." The trip to the county seat was a tense affair. Elena felt exposed, vulnerable, away from the safety of their small house. But sitting in the truck beside David, with Sophia and Leo in the back, she also felt a sliver of confidence. They were not running anymore. They were fighting back. At the county records office, a bored-looking clerk listened to their story with skepticism. But as David laid out the evidence, Isabella's diary, the old deed, his own original birth certificate showing the name Miguel, and the legal documents for his name change, the clerk's expression shifted to one of intense interest. The final piece was Sophia's affidavit, which she signed with a firm, steady hand. The clerk checked the old plat maps, his fingers tracing the lines. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, stamping the new paperwork with a satisfying thud. "Congratulations, Mr. David. You are the official owner of this property." Walking out into the sunshine, Elena felt as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. They had a legal shield. They had a right to be there. David smiled, a real warm smile that reached his kind eyes. "Now," he said, a hard glint in his gaze, "let's go pay a visit to my dear half-brothers." They didn't drive back to the adobe house. Instead, David drove them directly to the house in Las Cruces, the home from which Elena and Sophia had been so cruelly expelled. Luis's truck was parked in the driveway. As they pulled up, Luis himself came storming out of the front door, his face purple with rage. "What are you doing here?" he yelled, striding toward David's truck. "This is my property. You're trespassing." David got out of the truck, moving to stand between Luis and the cab, where Elena and Sophia sat watching. He was calm, his posture relaxed, but he radiated an aura of immovable strength. "Actually," David said, his voice even, "we need to talk about property and about our father, Arturo Vargas." Luis froze, his mouth hanging open. "What do you know about my father?" "More than you think," David said. "My name is David, but I was born Miguel. My mother was Isabella." The color drained from Luis's face. He stared at David, his mind scrambling to process the impossible. Behind him, Jorge had appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of fear. "You're lying," Luis stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. My father didn't have other children." "He did," David said, his voice cold as ice. "He had a son that your grandfather forced into hiding, and he left that son a piece of land, the land you trespassed on 2 nights ago, the land where you assaulted my niece." He let the word hang in the air. Niece, family. "The deed has been officially registered. The house is mine. You and your brother are to stay away from it. You are to stay away from them." He gestured to Elena and Sophia. "If I see you anywhere near them again, I won't just be a neighbor checking on a noise. I will be a brother and an uncle protecting his family. Do you understand me?" Luis was speechless, his arrogance completely shattered. He looked from David's unyielding face to Sophia, who stared back at him with cold disappointment. Jorge, standing on the porch, began to tremble visibly. The foundation of their greedy scheme was crumbling before their eyes. Their next move was as predictable as it was pathetic. The following afternoon, a county sheriff's car pulled up to the adobe house. Luis and Jorge stood behind the officer, their faces smug. They had called the police, claiming illegal occupation. The officer, a portly man with a tired expression, listened patiently to Luis's frantic claims of squatters and trespassers. Then he walked over to David, who was waiting calmly by the newly repaired front door. "Sir, I have a complaint here that you are on this property illegally." David simply handed him the freshly stamped and certified copy of the title. The officer read it, then read it again. He walked back to his car to check the registration on his computer. A few minutes later, he walked back, handing the document to David. "Title's clean, registered in your name this week. Looks like you're the legal owner." He turned to Luis and Jorge, his expression now one of annoyance. "You two have wasted my time. This is a civil matter, but as far as ownership goes, he has the right to be here, and you don't. If I get another call like this, I'll consider it misuse of police resources. Now get off this property before the owner decides to have you charged with trespassing." The humiliation was total. Defeated and exposed, the two brothers slunk back to their truck, shooting daggers of pure hatred at David and Elena. As they drove away, Elena knew this wasn't the end. Men like Luis didn't accept defeat gracefully. Their greed and pride had been wounded, and that made them more dangerous than ever. But for now, they had won. If this story has moved you so far, if you have felt Elena's anguish and Sophia's strength, leave a like and stay until the end, because what comes now is even more exciting. A few days later, a fragile peace settled over the small homestead. With the immediate threat of her uncles neutralized, another older wound began to ache in Elena's heart. The wound left by Marco. She had his son in her arms, a beautiful, perfect boy who would one day ask about his father. She couldn't let that question hang in the air, unanswered. She needed to close that chapter, not for Marco, but for herself and for Leo. She asked David if he would drive her into town. She didn't explain why, but he seemed to understand. He simply nodded and said, "Of course." Leaving Leo in the loving care of Sophia, Elena rode with David back to the city. She found Marco's address through an old mutual friend. He lived in a modern, sterile apartment complex that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the earthy reality of their adobe house. When he answered the door, his expression shifted from surprise to annoyance, and then to a flicker of guilt. He looked the same, handsome, well-dressed. But to Elena he seemed smaller now, his confidence nothing more than a shallow shell. "Elena, what are you doing here?" he asked, blocking the doorway. "I'm not here to ask for anything, Marco," she said, her voice steady. "I just thought you should know. You have a son. His name is Leo. He's beautiful, and he's healthy." She watched his face, saw the flicker of something, curiosity, regret, in his eyes before he masked it. "Look, Elena, I told you," he began, reaching for his wallet. "I can give you some money for the problem." Elena held up a hand, stopping him. The offer of money, once something she might have desperately needed, was now an insult. "He is not a problem, Marco. He is my son, and I don't need your money." A quiet strength filled her. "When I needed help, you weren't there, but help arrived. It just didn't come from you." She saw the confusion and a hint of shame on his face. She had not come here to yell or to cry or to beg. She had come to state a fact, to close a door. She had severed the last toxic tie to her past. She turned without another word and walked away, leaving him standing in his doorway, a ghost from a life she no longer wanted. As she got back into David's truck, she felt a profound sense of release. She was free. "Let's go home," she said to David, and for the first time, the word home didn't refer to the house she had lost, but the one she was building. The days that followed were filled with the simple, satisfying rhythm of work and family. Elena and David worked side by side, repairing the roof, planting a small vegetable garden near the well, and painting the interior walls a warm, cheerful white. They talked for hours, sharing dreams and sorrows. Elena saw in David a kindness and respect she had never experienced from a man before. He didn't see her as a victim or a burden. He saw her as an equal, a partner. A slow, tentative affection began to grow between them, as natural and steady as the desert sun. One evening, as Elena was feeding Leo his dinner, the baby looked over at David, who was fixing a loose floorboard. Leo pointed a chubby finger and said, "Clear as day, Dada." The world stopped. David froze, hammer in hand. Elena's heart swelled. It was just a sound, a baby's babble. But in the quiet warmth of their small house, it felt like a prophecy. David looked at Elena, a look of wonder and profound emotion on his face. It was in that moment that she knew her heart was no longer broken. It was healing, and it was opening up again. But their fragile peace was about to be shattered. That night, David returned from his ranch with a worried look on his face. "Someone broke into my tool shed," he said, his voice grim. "They didn't take much, just a crowbar and a full can of gasoline." Elena's blood ran cold. A crowbar, a can of gasoline. She looked at David, and in his eyes she saw the same terrifying thought that was forming in her own mind. This wasn't over. Her uncles were not just going to walk away. Their hatred was a poison, just as Sophia had said, and it was about to be unleashed. The phone call came just after dawn, a frantic, jarring ring from the satellite phone David had brought for emergencies. It was David, his voice tight with panic. "Elena, listen to me. I just found tire tracks near my property line. They didn't use the road. They cut cross-country. They're coming for you. That gasoline. They're going to burn the house down. You have to get out. Get out now." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Fire. The thought was so monstrous, so evil, it was almost incomprehensible. Luis's twisted logic echoed in her mind. If the house disappears, the problem disappears. Her heart hammered in her chest, but adrenaline and pure terror took over. "Abuela!" she screamed, running into the bedroom. "We have to go, now!" She scooped up a sleeping Leo from his crib, wrapping him tightly in a blanket. She grabbed Sophia's arm, pulling the startled old woman toward the door. There was no time for suitcases, no time for anything. Just survival. They burst out of the house into the cold morning air, their only thought to get to the main road, to run, to escape. But they were too late. As they cleared the cluster of mesquite trees, they saw it. Their escape was cut off. Luis's truck was parked sideways across the dirt track, blocking their path to the road, and advancing toward them on foot were Luis and Jorge. Luis's face was a terrifying mask of deranged fury. He was ranting, his words lost to the wind, but his eyes burned with a mad fire. In one hand, he carried a crowbar. In the other, the red can of gasoline. Jorge stumbled behind him, his face ashen, pleading, "Luis, no! Don't do this! It's gone too far!" "It's not far enough," Luis shrieked, his eyes locked on the adobe house. "This house! Everything is because of this house. It took my father. It brought him here." He gestured wildly at the sky. "And now it's trying to take what is mine." He was completely unhinged, lost in a paranoid delusion fueled by greed and decades of resentment. Sophia stepped forward, her frail body a surprisingly solid barrier between her grandsons and her family. "Luis, for the love of God, stop," she pleaded, her voice cracking with anguish. "I am your mother." "You stopped being my mother when you chose them over us," he screamed back, pointing a trembling finger at Elena. He shoved past the old woman, ignoring her cries, and ran to the house. With a roar of pure rage, he began sloshing the gasoline onto the dry adobe wall, the pungent smell filling the air, a harbinger of destruction. Jorge fell to his knees, sobbing. "Please, Luis, please stop." But Luis was beyond reason. He threw the empty can aside, fumbling in his pocket. He pulled out a lighter. In that horrifying, suspended moment, another sound cut through the air, the high-pitched whine of a powerful engine pushed to its limit. David's truck appeared over a rise, flying across the rough terrain at full speed. David saw the glint of the lighter in Luis's hand. He didn't hesitate. He swerved the truck, aiming it not at Luis, but beside him, and slammed on the brakes, sending the truck into a skidding halt just feet away. He leaped from the still-moving vehicle, a warrior coming to the defense of his kingdom. But Luis was faster. With a final triumphant scream, he flicked the lighter and threw it at the gasoline-soaked wall. The world erupted in a whoosh of orange and yellow. The wall of the house instantly burst into a curtain of roaring flames, the heat so intense it drove them all back. The dry ancient wood of the window frames and roof beams caught immediately. Black smoke billowed into the clear morning sky. David tackled Luis, sending them both sprawling to the ground. They wrestled in the dirt, a desperate, clumsy fight. But Elena wasn't watching them. Her eyes were fixed on the burning house, their home, everything they had built. And inside, on the mantelpiece, was the wooden box, the letters, the diary, the proof of their history, of David's identity. It was the foundation of their new life. She couldn't let it burn. Without a second thought, driven by an instinct more powerful than fear, she ran. She ran toward the fire. "Elena, no!" She heard David and Sophia scream, but their voices sounded far away. She covered her face with her arm and plunged through the doorway into the inferno. Inside, the heat was a physical blow. The room was a vortex of smoke and fire. The air was thick, searing her lungs. She could hear the roar of the flames and the terrifying groan of the roof beams above her. Through the swirling black smoke, she saw it, the box, silhouetted against the flames, licking up the fireplace. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around the hot wood. As she turned to flee, a deafening crack echoed above her. A huge charred roof beam broke free and came crashing down, landing across her legs, pinning her to the floor. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through her. She was trapped. The smoke was choking her. The heat was unbearable. She clutched the precious box to her chest, her vision starting to blur. Suddenly a figure materialized in the smoke. It was David. His face was grim, his eyes wild with terror for her. "Elena!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. He tried to lift the beam, his muscles straining, but it was too heavy. The fire was closing in. The ceiling was about to collapse. He saw a section of the back wall, weakened by the fire, starting to crumble. With a desperate roar, he threw his shoulder against it, once, twice, and the adobe bricks gave way. creating a jagged hole to the outside. He scrambled back to her. "I can't lift it! You have to slide out!" he yelled over the roar of the fire. He grabbed her arms and pulled. Agony tore through her, but the will to live, for Leo, for David, for Sophia, was stronger. She pushed the box through the opening, then, with David pulling and her screaming through clenched teeth, she wriggled her legs free from under the heavy timber. He dragged her through the hole just as the entire roof gave way with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the sky. They lay on the ground outside, gasping, coughing, covered in soot. But they were alive. Elena's leg was broken. She was burned, but she was alive. And clutched in her hands, charred and blackened but intact, was the wooden box. In the distance, a new sound began to grow, the wail as of sirens. David, with incredible foresight, had called 911 before he had even left his ranch. As fire trucks and police cars swarmed the property, the fight was over. The police descended on a stunned and defeated Luis, cuffing him as David explained what had happened. Jorge, seeing the flashing lights, broke down completely. He started confessing everything, from the fraudulent house deed to the plan to burn the adobe house, his words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and fear. The final battle was over. Justice had arrived. The aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos and quiet devastation. Firefighters doused the last of the flames, leaving behind a steaming, blackened skeleton of what was once a home. Paramedics carefully stabilized Elena's leg, her face etched with pain, but her eyes clear and resolute. She refused to let go of the charred wooden box until Sophia took it from her, holding it like a sacred relic. David stood beside her as they loaded her into the ambulance, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent, steady presence. The house was gone. The physical manifestation of their new beginning had been reduced to ashes. But as Elena looked at David's soot-stained, worried face, at her grandmother holding her son, she knew that the house was never the most important thing. The home they had built was not made of adobe and wood. It was made of the bonds between them. Later that day, at the hospital, David sat by her bed. Her leg was in a heavy cast, and her arms were bandaged for minor burns, but she was safe. "The house is gone, Elena," he said softly, his voice heavy with loss. "We're alive, David," she replied, reaching for his hand. "That's all that matters." He squeezed her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "My ranch. My house is too big for one man. It's quiet and empty. Come live with me. All of you. Not as guests, as family." The offer was not made out of pity. It was made out of love, out of a deep sense of belonging. Tears of relief and gratitude welled in Elena's eyes. She nodded. "Okay," she whispered. For the first time, they were not running to something but being welcomed into it. That night, Sophia and Leo slept in warm, clean beds at David's ranch, safe under his roof. Weeks later, while Elena was still recovering, a call came from a lawyer David had hired. With Jorge's full confession and the evidence from Isabella's diary, the fraudulent transfer of Sophia's house in Las Cruces had been officially annulled. The house was hers again, free and clear. But when David told her the news, Sophia's reaction was surprising. "Sell it," she said without hesitation. "That house is full of bad memories now. It's tainted by their greed." She looked out the window of David's ranch, toward the distant, smoke-stained patch of land where their little house had stood. "This land is where I want to be. That is where Arturo's heart was. That is our home. Use the money to rebuild it. Properly, this time." The trial was a somber affair. Jorge, in exchange for a lighter sentence, testified against his brother. His testimony was a pathetic and damning account of greed spiraling into madness. But the most powerful moment came when Sophia took the stand. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She spoke with a devastating, quiet dignity that filled the courtroom with a heavy silence. She looked directly at Luis, who refused to meet her gaze. "That man," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is not my son. My son died a long time ago, replaced by a creature of greed and hate. I do not ask for vengeance. I only ask for justice." The judge's words were stern and unwavering. "You have violated one of the most sacred bonds that exists, the bond between a son and a mother. You have let greed consume your humanity." Luis was sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison with no possibility of parole for arson, attempted murder, and fraud. As he was led away in handcuffs, a broken and defeated man, Elena felt not triumph, but a profound sadness for the family that had been destroyed. Justice had been served. The rebuilding began that spring. With the money from the sale of the Las Cruces house and David's own savings, they started to raise a new home from the ashes of the old one. It rose on the same foundation, built of the same earth. But it was stronger, bigger, and filled with light. Elena, her leg now healed, threw herself into the project. She was no longer a victim. She was a builder. She learned about framing and wiring and plumbing, her hands becoming skilled, her mind sharp. She was the project manager, working alongside David and a small crew of local builders. As the house grew, so did their family. Leo took his first real steps on the new subfloor, toddling on unsteady legs straight into David's open arms. The love between Elena and David, forged in crisis and tempered by hard work, blossomed into a deep and abiding partnership. They were a team, in every sense of the word. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat outside the half-finished house, watching the sun set over the desert. The sky was a blaze of color. David turned to her, his face serious in the fading light. He didn't have a fancy ring. He didn't have a prepared speech. He simply took her hand, a hand that was now as calloused as his own. He picked up a piece of twine that had fallen from a bundle of supplies for Sophia's new garden. Awkwardly, he tied it around her finger. "Elena," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you gave me back my father's history. You gave me a future I never knew I could have. You gave me a family." He looked into her eyes. "Marry me. Build this life with me." Happy tears streamed down Elena's face as she looked at the simple twine ring, more precious than any diamond. After a lifetime in a storm, she was finally home. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Years passed. The new adobe house stood proud and strong, a testament to their resilience. The small vegetable garden became a thriving, small-scale organic farm, their produce sought after at local markets. David and Elena's partnership grew into a successful business and a loving marriage. They had a second child, a daughter with Isabella's eyes, whom they named Sophia. Their grandmother, the original Sophia, lived to the ripe old age of 92. She passed away peacefully, in her sleep, in her own sun-filled room, in the house her husband had first built for love, and that her family had rebuilt from ashes. She died surrounded by the laughter of her great-grandchildren, her heart full. On the mantelpiece of the new fireplace, in a place of honor, sat the charred but preserved wooden box. It was no longer a container of painful secrets, but a symbol of their foundation, a story they told their children about where they came from. Inspired by their own journey, Elena and David started a small foundation, using a portion of their farm's profits to help other families who had fallen on hard times, offering a hand up to those who felt lost and alone. On a warm summer evening, many years later, an older Elena and David sat on their porch, watching their own grandchildren play in the yard where fire and hatred once reigned. The desert, which had once seemed so threatening and empty, was now their sanctuary, their home. The road that had seemed to lead to nowhere had in fact led them exactly where they were always meant to be. The house stood as a testament not only to the cruelty that humans can inflict upon one another, but to the incredible, unyielding resilience of the human spirit to rebuild, to forgive, and to love. What did you think of Elena's incredible journey? This story teaches us that even when we are cast out into the desert of our lives, left with nothing, we can find an oasis of hope. It reminds us that our true foundation is not built of wood or stone, but of love, resilience, and the courage to build a new future from the ashes of the past. The greatest treasures are not always made of gold, but are found in the hidden histories and unbreakable bonds that make us who we are. If you believe in the strength of family and the power of new beginnings, show your support by commenting with the word resilience. Your engagement helps us to continue bringing you stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. We love reading your thoughts and learning how these narratives resonate with you. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. We are grateful for every moment you spend with us, sharing in these tales of struggle and triumph. Your time and attention are the greatest compliments we can receive. We hope this story brought you a sense of hope and vindication. If it did, please leave a like to let us know and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another touching story like this one. We look forward to seeing you again next time.